Scientific American: The Truth About Genetically Modified Food by David H. Friedman. Robert Goldberg, a plant molecular biologist at the University of California, Los Angeles, is frustrated with the nonstop need to confront what he sees as false fears over the health risks of genetically modified crops. Particularly frustrating to him, he says, is that this debate should have ended many years ago when researchers produced much evidence clearing GM foods of all these charges. Despite overwhelming evidence that GM crops are safe to eat, the debate over their use continues to rage. Skeptics and disbelievers would argue that this dispute is a good thing, that we cannot be too cautious when interfering with the DNA of the world's food supply. To researchers such as Goldberg, however, the continuation of fears about GM foods is nothing short of maddening. In spite of hundreds of millions of genetic experiments involving every type of organism on Earth, he says, and people eating billions of meals without a problem, we've gone back to being ignorant. So who's right? Supporters of GM foods or critics of GM foods? When we look carefully at the evidence for both sides and weigh the risks and benefits, we find a surprisingly clear path out of this dilemma. Benefits and worries. The bulk of the science on the safety of GM crops points in one direction. Take it from David Silberman, a UC Berkeley agricultural and environmental economist, and one of the few researchers considered credible by both agricultural chemical companies and their critics. He argues that the benefits of GM crops greatly outweigh the health risks, which remain theoretical so far. The use of GM crops has lowered the price of food, Silverman says. It has increased farmer safety by allowing them to use less pesticides. It has raised the production of corn, cotton, and soy by 20 to 30%, allowing some people to survive who would not have without it. If it were widely adopted around the world, the price would go lower and fewer people would die of hunger. In the future, Silberman says, those advantages will become all the more significant. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that the world will have to grow 70% more food by 2050 just to keep up with population growth. Climate change will make much of the world's land more difficult to farm. GM crops, Silberman says, could produce higher yields, grow in dry and salty land, withstand high and low temperatures, and tolerate insects, disease, and herbicides. A clean record. Humans have been selectively breeding crops, thus altering plants' DNA, for hundreds of years. Ordinary wheat has long been strictly a human-engineered plant. It could not exist outside of farms because its seeds do not scatter. For some 60 years, scientists have been using mutagenic techniques to scramble the DNA of plants with radiation and chemicals, creating strains of wheat, rice, peanuts, and pears that have become very important in agriculture. The practice has inspired little objection from scientists or the public and has caused no known health problems. The difference is that selective breeding or mutagenic techniques tend to result in large amounts of genes being swapped or altered. On the other hand, GM technology enables scientists to insert a single gene, or a few of them, into a plant's DNA from another species of plant, or even from a bacterium, virus, or animal. Supporters argue that this precision makes technology much less likely to produce surprises. Most plant molecular biologists also say that in the highly unlikely case that an unexpected health threat emerged from a new GM plant, scientists would quickly identify and eliminate it. We know where the gene goes and can measure the activity of every single gene around it, Goldberg says. We can show exactly which changes occur and which don't. Supporters say people have consumed as many as trillions of meals containing genetically modified ingredients over the past few decades. Not a single verified case of illness has ever been attributed to the genetic alterations. Mark Linus, a well-known anti-GM activist who last year publicly switched to strongly supporting the technology, has pointed out that every single news-making food disaster on record has been attributed to non-GM crops, such as the E. coli infected organic bean sprouts that killed 53 people in Europe in 2011. Critics often criticize U.S. research on the safety of genetically modified foods, which is often funded or even conducted by GM companies such as Monsanto. But much research on the subject comes from the European Commission. The European Commission has funded 130 research projects carried out by more than 500 independent teams on the safety of GM crops. None of those studies found any special risks from GM crops. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Medical Association, and the National Academy of Sciences have all completely supported GM crops. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, along with its counterparts in several other countries, has repeatedly reviewed large bodies of research and concluded that GM crops pose no unique health threats. Dozens of review studies carried out by academic researchers have backed that view. Persistent doubts. Not all complaints about genetically modified foods are so easily thrown out, however. Long-term health effects can be subtle and nearly impossible to link to specific changes in the environment. Scientists have long believed that Alzheimer's disease and many cancers have environmental components, but few would argue we have identified all of them. Changing a single gene might turn out to be a more destabilizing action with unexpected ripple effects, including the production of new proteins that might be toxins or allergens, than traditional breeding techniques. Challengers also point out that just because there is no evidence to date that genetic material from a GM crop can make it into the DNA of people who eat it, does not mean it will never happen, or that it has not already happened and we have yet to spot it. A way forward. There is a middle ground in this debate. Many moderate voices call for continuing the supply of GM foods while maintaining or even stepping up safety testing on new GM crops. They promote keeping a close eye on the health and environmental impact of existing ones. Even Schubert agrees. In spite of his concerns, he believes future GM crops can be introduced safely if testing is improved.